Thank you again, General Allen. It is such an honor and a pleasure to welcome you back, even though it's virtually, to our World Affairs Council. So before we get started, I just want to ask, how are your families staying safe and well?
Well, we're doing great, Megan. Thank you very much. We're doing great. The whole Brookings family is doing well also. We've been on telework now since about the 13th of March. But my sincere hope is that you and everyone at the World Affairs Council in Connecticut, but of course everyone who is watching this today, that they're all safe and well also. And I hope that applies to you specifically. So thank you, Megan, for this opportunity. I'm really honored to be back with you.
Thank you so much. So as we sit here today, we are literally in the middle of a truly global crisis. 3.8 million people confirmed and tested for COVID-19, over 270,000 dead across the world. This crisis has major economic impacts globally. We know, and domestically, we saw our jobs report today, as well as, crisis issues like global food security. So there's a lot of impacts that the world is experiencing because of COVID. So as we look at putting the world back together, how can the global community, including our leaders, best cooperate to address how we begin to emerge from this crisis?
Well, I think that question can generate an entire conversation, I think. Look, first and foremost, we have to all acknowledge that we're not going to get out of this unless we work together. That's not only a US mantra that we have to adopt, but it's going to be a global mantra as well. It's going to require leadership, selfless leadership, that will bring together all of the key players in the world to both manage the crisis at a global level, to help those states that need the help to manage the crisis at a local or a regional level, but also to pool our medical and scientific and technological capabilities to try to bring this terrible blight to heal. Went through some numbers a moment ago, which should shock us all. We're about 90 days into this, and we have sustained, speaking as an American, and I was enlisted at the time during Vietnam, we have exceeded all of the casualties of Vietnam, which was considered a 20-year conflict for the United States, in 90 days. But unlike Vietnam, where we did not see the devastation of the American economy, that has also occurred. Virtually every American in some form or another has been affected by this. We sustained enormous numbers of casualties, and many of the people who have become stricken and recovered are going to be affected for some period of time. So this is truly a national emergency, and it's a global emergency. And Megan, to your point, we are not going to get out of this unless we have visionary, inspirational leadership to bring the world together at this moment of crisis in order for us to find the capacity to get ourselves out of it.
So, as we begin to emerge from this crisis, are we seeing global cooperation, and where should we be hope to seeing more? Or where should
first, I want to try not to take this to a political conversation, but I've been involved. I've been involved in 5 different global international coalitions. One of them I commanded, another one I led, I participated in others, and without exception, every single one of them was the result of American leadership. And what we need right now is for American leadership to lead the global response. And in the absence of that, because we haven't, in the absence of that, what we find is some level of confrontation between the particular participants, which is the United States and China. This is an opportunity, even though we have very different political systems, even though we have very different views on human rights, et cetera, the scientific capacity for us to cooperate and generally bring the world's scientific and medical communities together to find a therapeutic regime, but also to find the kinds of drugs necessary for a vaccine. This is a rare opportunity, yet we find ourselves not cooperating at a global level, but in competition in many respects. So this is what needs to happen. And we have written at Brookings, and I have participated in these kinds of webinars with Chinese leadership and Chinese medical and scientific leadership to try to create the platforms necessary for us to have the cooperation necessary at a global level to try to find a solution to the immediate crisis, a vaccine to the virus, and to create resilience in the international system, which ultimately can prevent this from roaring back at us in the fall, when there's a good chance there will be a second wave, or a mutation of this virus, which could come at us with an even more virulent effect. We've got to coordinate now, we've got to cooperate now, and this requires global leadership to do so.
So as we've all been participating in C by C this week and attending, webinars from World Affairs Councils around the country, one of the things that we have been hearing about is this trend globally towards authoritarianism during this pandemic. Is this a trend that you're following? In what ways do you think that this pandemic may be empowering authoritarian leadership?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's an important question because often illiberal regimes, these are regimes that might have been democratic at one point but have drifted to illiberal measures in the relationship between the government and society. Often illiberal regimes or authoritarian regimes will use national crises as the basis or the platform for them to extend even greater control over the population. So we have seen that. Hungary, for example, used to be a very vibrant and functioning democracy. It isn't anymore, frankly. And Viktor Orban has used this as an opportunity to achieve even greater control over the population, invoking his authority to deal with COVID. And we've seen it in other places as well. But I think we're also going to see a reality here that in democracies, people want to be inspired in moments of crisis. They want to be led in moments of crisis. And in democracies, remember that leadership governs. In illiberal societies or authoritarian states, leadership rules. And so in many respects, in the democracies, the leaders who are governing, who can demonstrate inspirational leadership and decisive action on behalf of the population, I think the outcome can actually strengthen democracy around the world. And we're seeing that in Europe, even though there are some desperate moments where populations have had to lock themselves down. In large measure, you have seen those populations willingly accept those kinds of difficult measures in a democracy in order to preserve the unity and the coherence of the social fabric. So where it can happen, I think we will see illiberal leaders seek to use this moment as an opportunity to extend their authoritarian instincts and reflexes. The question really isn't whether they'll do it or not. I think that's a reflex that we will always be faced with in these moments. Strong men will always do that. And by the way, it's almost always strong men. But the question then becomes, in the aftermath of the crisis, will a democracy be able to recover the lost ground? And it's not clear that that'll be the case, but I've seen very strong and decisive leadership. Angela Merkel, President Tsai in Taiwan, President Moon in South Korea. They have moved quickly within functioning and strong democracies to be able to take the steps necessary to protect the population, but at the same time preserve democracy. And we need to see where that happened in the aftermath. And we need to strengthen those reflexes and strengthen our ties with those schools, those countries and those societies, and do all we can to recover democracy in the aftermath.
So as we again have been following trends, one of the reoccurring themes we've been talking about as well is this great power competition between the United States and China. I mean, as we emerge, what the global stage is going to look like in a post-COVID world. So I guess the question would be, which nations will come through this pandemic with more influence on the global stage, and are there nations that will come through with diminished power?
Well, I think there's no question that China is seeking to enhance its influence in the aftermath of the virus. There there are active measures that China is taking in the context of something called COVID diplomacy or mask diplomacy, where they have sought to extend a helping hand to other countries in the world, both with medical experience, medical capabilities, and also personal protective equipment, PPE, to try to reach out in the aftermath of this pandemic, or the aftermath of the spread of this disease, to both create a relationship with countries that they may not have had before, but also to extend their influence in the aftermath. So I think we're going to see that. While I know the United States has at some level and in some ways reached out, it has not pursued this in the kind of public way that we probably need to put emphasis again on our global leadership. Look, the United States brings two things to every crisis, or at least it did until recently. It brought two things to every crisis in the world. It brought strategic leadership and it brought global reach. And the strategic leadership is the capacity to convene the community of nations at a moment of crisis to solve a desperate problem, whether that is the South Asia tsunami, whether that's the Islamic State, whether that's containing the Soviet Union, whether it's whatever it might be, whether it's about a pandemic. The capacity of the United States from a position of moral strength and global leadership to bring together the community of nations to solve a difficult problem is an important contribution the United States has made in the post-Cold War era. But it also brings strategic reach. And most people think of strategic reach in the context of military reach. But truly one of the most powerful forces on the planet today is the economy of the United States and the capacity of the United States technologically and scientifically to lead the world. And here is an opportunity for us, through our moral position on the world stage, to create the leadership opportunity and to be the catalyst to bring together the scientific approaches, the technological approaches that could not only solve this problem, but position the United States in the 21st century to be the undisputed moral leader in the world. We're missing that opportunity. And I wish that we could see that this isn't about a moment-to-moment confrontation with the Chinese. This is about the United States leading with the Chinese working with us, so that in the aftermath, with such countries as France and Germany and Italy, the United Kingdom, other countries, China, Japan, and South Korea, that have all had to go through this, that all yearn for global leadership, this is the United States' chance to come out of this with a sense and a position of global leadership that we've not seen clearly since the end of the Cold War. And my fear is we may not be able to seize this moment.
Thank you, General Allen. So you mentioned the United States economy, but what we have also been seeing is, shifts in economic and technological trends. Do you think that COVID-19 is going to reshape what the world looks like? Are we going to see those technological and economic trends being advanced, accelerated because of COVID-19?
I think there's a chance for that, but I also think we're still positioned well as a nation technologically to lead in this regard. But we have to recognize that the Chinese, again, have put enormous investments into technology in the last several years, to include artificial intelligence. And with those kinds of investments, and with technology playing such an important role at this particular moment in finding the kinds of therapeutic drugs that are necessary and to find the kinds of vaccine or vaccines that will be necessary, those countries that are technologically advanced, and in particular in the context of the community of democracies, of which we theoretically ought to be leading, the capacity for us to aggregate those technological and innovative reflexes will, I think, accelerate our capacity to be technologically advanced. My fear is that once again, the Chinese have a very strong technological basis, a very strong medical basis, and the competition that could emerge, I think, will almost certainly occur. The question is, does that competition ultimately result in the United States and the community of democracies being number two, or number one. I think we have the ability to come out of this and be technologically and economically preeminent still, but we need to see this as a global problem and exert global leadership in its solution.
Thank you. So one last question before we go to audience questions, but I want to remind everybody listening to use the Q&A function to ask a question of General Allen, and to use the chat function to talk to your fellow attendees. So while the world is so hyper-focused on COVID-19, as we should be, are there global issues that are getting foreshadowed that we really need to keep on the forefront that, that we should be paying attention to right now?
Well, I think we will see that the challenges that we were facing as we went into this pandemic, many of those challenges will still exist as we begin to emerge from the pandemic. I mean, the United States and again, the global community of nations, and I use that term specifically as opposed to the West, because often the West has become an exclusionary term. The great democracies and the great economies of East Asia are very powerful forces that stand for the same values we do, and we should be thinking broadly about this community of nations. I think that the community of nations has an opportunity. You talked about hotspots. Let me talk about a bright spot for a moment. And I think, again, there is an opportunity coming out of this for the United States to lead an aggregation of the community of democracies in a way we've never seen before. We're going to have to rethink many aspects of how we do business in this world. And we need to refocus our attention, not on the West, but on the community of democracies, which is a values-based organization if we do this correctly. That'll stand for our values, stand for human rights, stand for the development of those parts of the world that can use rights-based, human rights-based development, that can celebrate our science and our technology, that can take advantage of all of these things to the betterment of all humankind. Now, there are going to be still some hotspots. We have massive inequality still in this world. And we ought to be focused on trying to resolve issues of inequality in order to provide a level of human existence that is tolerable in the 21st century. And if we don't come out of this recognizing that some aspects of inequality have been so exposed by this virus that it's no longer ignorable, it should be no longer tolerable, and so we should be dealing with inequality as a global problem. The next is climate. Look, lots of parts of the world today we can breathe where we couldn't breathe before. If we haven't seen a reason for us globally to cooperate on the issue of climate change and global warming, this is that opportunity for us to see the practical demonstration of us dealing with this. So global inequality, climate, those are just two obvious opportunities. The capacity for us to deal with the next pandemic is another. And then of course you have the geopolitical issues. We're still going to have problems with China. I think we will exacerbate those when we really have an opportunity to find opportunities to cooperate. I think the Russians are going to become, the Russian Republic, the Federal Russian Republic, I think is going to become a less stable rather than more stable entity. And a nuclear-armed, unstable Russia is not good for anyone. We'll see how North Korea turns out. We know that Iran has been devastated by this. That may equate to instability. And then, of course, the jihadist terrorists are on the march. They will always be. We'll have to keep an eye on them and be willing to cooperate globally to deal with those. So we will have hotspots. There'll be no question. Let's also look for the bright spots.
That was great to hear, that there is still, some things to look forward to even in the middle of this crisis, and that, there's still a lot of potential to be reached. So going to some audience questions, and, there are so many, I'm going to try and combine a few. So what are some of the top national and global security threats you think we're facing during COVID-19? And to what extent do you think some of these protests, or these reopening protests we're seeing across the US are, being influenced from outside, from abroad?
I don't think there's any question that there are external influences seeking to create an information environment that works to our disadvantage. I don't think there's any question of that. And as we think about that, the American leadership in this crisis ought to be in every possible way seeking to create not just the reality of, but the appearance of our national unity. This should be an opportunity for us to achieve a national unity around a national emergency that we have not seen in most of the living memory of our country. Yet sadly, we have, I think, failed to do that. We have governors who are doing a great job in leading their states in trying to save the population and trying to remedy this issue. We've seen mayors working very, very hard at the local level and municipal level to try to solve these problems. But we haven't seen the national unity that we need. And that's a problem. And that's exacerbated by the external foreign influences that we see coming at us over our social networks, et cetera, that seek to either accelerate or expose those seams within our society that are vulnerable to those kinds of disinformation or misinformation. And one of the things that we have seen very clearly as a result of this pandemic, and as we have seen it in the United States, very clearly has been the exposure of that element of the population that is poor, or that element of the population that is vulnerable, that part of the population which doesn't benefit from equity or suffers inequality, our Black population, the brown population. We should be very, very attentive in the reopening process, very, very attentive in the recovery process, that we try systematically and as a matter of policy objective to deal with those issues of equity and inequality in our government, and not permit them to be open, festering wounds that create opportunities for those elements within our own society, the white supremacists, et cetera. You're seeing them showing up with weapons in these state capitals, and foreign influence to further divide us as a country when we desperately need unity, ultimately to achieve the outcome of defeating the virus and restoring the social fabric of the United States.
Thank you. So another audience question, you know, we all believe the world is going to be forever changed. And can you talk about in what specific ways you see the world being changed forever because of
Sure.
COVID-19?
Again, I think that there are changes that will potentially be negative, but once again, this is a rare opportunity. As bad as this is, with so many thousands, tens of thousands of dead, and our hearts should be with those families every second. But this is a rare opportunity we've not seen before to rethink some of the ways we have been doing business. For example, one of the reasons we're in this problem is that institutions and processes and bureaucracies of the 20th century had not been prepared or were not equipped to deal with the immediacy and the pressures of this virus as it broke out into a pandemic. And so things that we had relied on that in many respects affected our lives from moment to moment failed at this moment of stress. So as we think about recovery, not so much reopening, and there are real vulnerabilities right now in the reopening process, but as we think about long-term recovery, as we will do at Brookings, we're not just thinking about recovery in the context of trying to find the status quo ante, because we will never be there again. We should be looking for opportunities for reform, to systematically build resilience into institutions of government and processes, but even more importantly, in maybe a blue sky manner, think about completely rethinking dimensions of who we are as a people for the future. For example, if we do this right, we can rethink the way we educate in this country. We have typically believed that education required a physical presence and a physical infrastructure that carried with it a certain amount of overhead and costs, et cetera. We may be able to rethink that entirely. Telemedicine. Many people in our country and many people around the world haven't got access at all, in many respects, to the kinds of medical care that they really need. Here is an opportunity with broadband access that we should be thinking now very systematically about extending to much of the world's population, being able to bring telemedicine right into the homes of most of our citizens and citizens around the world. And then I think very importantly, how do we work You know, when I bring back people to Brookings, whenever we finally do go back to Brookings, we're going to have to think about the efficiencies that we have realized now. We've actually become more productive in 400 satellite offices, which is our homes, than we were when we were a great big mass of people in 3 buildings. I think the process of considering work and considering workers and considering the work infrastructure, these are things that if we do this right as we recover, we will find that even though we went through a horrible moment, a desperate moment of darkness and disease and death, that we have an obligation to everyone who suffered to try to think about the world in a different way, to emerge from this that places us more securely in an environment with resilience to defend against the next pandemic, but also positions us in a way where humankind simply operates better.
Thank you so much. So a question about China. I'm going to try and consolidate a few questions from the audience, and very specifically about the military in China and their rise to power. We heard General Mark Milley on NPR this morning speak about his concerns about the rise in hypersonics and satellite technology and how the U.S. really needs to try and compete. And someone from the audience, do you think the U.S. and China can coexist as two very strong military powers?
Well, I think so. Look, Graham Allison, who's a magnificent scholar and wrote the book about the U.S.-Chinese competition and talked about this thing called the Thucydides trap, stipulates that anytime a status quo power, us, deals with a rising power, in this case China, history would say that the chances are very good that there will be some form of a conflict between the two. Now, he doesn't guarantee that, and he's, again, a very wise scholar, and his scholarship in this regard has been a very important flashing yellow light for both countries. But look, we, because of our national unity, because of our international leadership, because of our technological and scientific superiority, we were able to coexist with one of the most abhorrent entities that the United States and our allies ever faced, and that was the Soviet Union. And we were eyeball to eyeball across 2 thermonuclear arsenals for a very, very long time, yet we were able to coexist. And on some things, we were actually able to cooperate. Now, the level of antipathy and the level of geopolitical or political ideological difference between the United States and China is actually far less than it was between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so while we must be militarily ready, we must be militarily prepared, and General Mark Milley is one of our greatest soldiers I've ever known. He's exactly right that we must be prepared for the Chinese military threat. Being prepared for that threat doesn't inherently commit us to a future of war with China. In fact, being prepared creates the real deterrent capability that we'll never have to fight with the Chinese. And if they can be convinced that the price of a conflict with the United States is unthinkable, then we can find that coexistence with the Chinese can bring some potential benefit to both our countries. And if we have the right diplomatic sense about us and the right sense of global leadership, we can actually find opportunity here as we lead the global community of democracies in the aftermath of this crisis.
So a question from our national office on the topic of Iran. And so we know 2020, we saw a lot of escalation between the United States and Iran. And then we saw some accelerated sanctions in early March. Do you think that we can, de-escalate the situation with Iran, or what do you think the future may hold?
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, the president, our president, has most of the levers on this issue. I don't think there's any secret here that when we departed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, that set in motion a series of events which ultimately brought us eyeball to eyeball with the Iranians in conflict, to include the missile attack on al-Assad a few months ago. But while I would say that we have real significant capabilities with military capabilities are unquestioned, and the Iranians would be foolish to try to take on the United States in a military sense. The question, I think, for us becomes, once again, at what point do these sanctions create such an enormous humanitarian crisis for the Iranian people that they become counterproductive? We have, I know, because I was part of the design of it, we have the capacity to deny Iran a nuclear weapon at any point that should we decide. But that's a wartime decision. In the meantime, the question is, how much pressure do we want to put on the Iranian people during this moment of crisis to achieve our long-term diplomatic ends? Because the Iranians don't seem to be changing their posture within the theater. What I don't think we fully grasp yet or fully understand is what has been the effect of this virus on Iranian leadership, because not an insignificant number of Iranian leaders have become sick. Some have died. And I think Iran is less stable today than it was before. And the question we have to decide is, do our sanctions create the environment in which we can have the diplomatic outcome that we want, or do our sanctions create even greater instability with Iran? And let me tell you what we don't want. We don't want regime collapse in Iran. We've been through that now in Iraq. We've been through that in Afghanistan. We need to be very careful about the level of constant pressure we put on Iranians, because if we have regime collapse there, there's no telling what the outcome could be.
So our time is coming to a close, but as we have one last question, General Allen, what do you have to say to us as a nation, as a world, as we look to rise to the challenge of putting the world back together after COVID-19? What are some of the things that we can be doing?
Well, I sort of touched this in a couple of my responses, and that is, let's seek opportunity in the aftermath of this to improve the human condition around the world. Look, so many of us are sick, so many have died, so many may never recover even though they are out of the hospital. Our economies are in tatters. Systems of processes that we have come to rely on over many, many years have failed us. If we've ever had an opportunity, I think, to think innovatively, to think creatively, to think in a humanitarian nature, we all emerge from this. This is that moment. This is our opportunity to address the systematic inequality in the world today. This is our opportunity to address, as I said, challenges of climate. This is an opportunity for us to extend a hand across what might have been difficult to see or even insurmountable political barriers, to find common ground between states that might have not otherwise be willing to cooperate, to find a common future together where we can share at least common interests. We may never share common values, but we may find that we can share common interests. I think we should look for the opportunity in this crisis, solve the issues that we immediately face, and seek opportunity in this crisis across so many sectors of thought, so many sectors of business and the economy, so many sectors of humanity, to find the bright spots as we emerge. And if we don't, we will have missed the great opportunity that's been handed us in this moment of desperate tragedy.
General Allen, I can't thank you enough for inspiring us, for sharing your thoughts with us today, and for your overall leadership. It means so much to us at the World Affairs Council, me personally, and I'm sure to everyone listening from across the country and around the world today. I want to thank you again. I want to encourage the audience to continue to, be part of C by C Amplified, Council by Council Amplified, to support your local World Affairs Council so we can continue to bring you discussions like this with the world's most important thinkers like General Allen. So General Allen, you stay safe and well, and thank you to everyone out there. Stay safe and well.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the World Affairs Councils, wherever they may be. They are an enormous help to us right now to think our way out of this. Thank you, Megan. Good day.